This is Paul Murray Live.
G'day, good evening. Our laser-like focus is 1,000 days to take the country back from the mad left. It's actually 1,069. I added it up today. All right, we'll get to all of it in a second, but let's deal with silver linings first, okay? KK lost. Christina Keneally gone. Her end was failing upwards has ended. She was done last night, but she has conceded today. Dai Lee is the new member for Fowler. Now, this says as much about everything that's gone on inside the election, but where does she go from here? Would I suggest a government has the capacity to send somebody to the Vatican? You heard it here first. All right, as for Dai Lee, why did she win? Well, she told Chris Smith a bit earlier tonight.
For me, it's not a campaign. For me, it's about constantly out there engaging and communicating with my community, and I do it ongoingly. So that's probably why, what we saw, what happened at this election.
This is going to be a theme you're going to hear a lot about tonight: local engagement, part of a community as opposed to top-down stuff. The other one, Jacinta Price is going to be a senator. Jacinta Price is, at this stage, leading and most likely to be elected to the parliament, to have her voice at a time where there's going to be a big national conversation about what happens with the Constitution, how Indigenous people are best represented, and her commitment to the issues of cultural and family violence in her communities. This is a brave lady. She'll be on our show a little bit later tonight. It is a 2-hour edition of Paul Murray Live. So before we get into anything else, I'm not going to pretend that the Labor Party won just and there's some sort of magical asterisk beside it. I'll get into how the Greens helped them in a second. Australia has spoken. They spoke loudly, and it's time to understand what they particularly said. I'm also not going to pretend that everything I said for the past 6 weeks as a warning about what's going to happen in the next 3 years, I stand by all of it. But there's no point being a sook. You take it on the chin. It is what it is. But if anyone thinks that that means that you're not allowed to criticise the new regime, well, I've got some news for you. Because, my fellow Australians, welcome to the first meeting of the new resistance. It's here each and every night at 8 o'clock. It gets stronger by the day, by the hour, and you are part of that. So, let's get to this here. 5 things that we learned out of the election before I get into all of the other hot takes that are around in the next little while. Number 1. Labor's win was built off a Greens surge. Now, credit to, I think, one opinion poll, might have been the Channel 9 one, that actually showed the Greens vote on the march, particularly in Queensland. Now, you've heard this point being made all day. Can I actually show you some numbers? So, Labor's primary vote was 32.8, Greens was 12. Labor went backwards just nationally, and the Greens went forward. Now, again, I'm not putting an asterisk on the win. Albo's the Prime Minister, they're the government. But they are, in my view, the wolf in the henhouse. The Greens won seats off Labor. So at the moment, they might help you get to government, but at some point, they're going to start to chew away at government. Let's have a look at it state by state. Labor down in New South Wales, but the Greens went up. In Victoria, Labor down, but the Greens went up. In Queensland, they went up, as did the Greens, by an even bigger margin. In South Australia, Labor went down, the Greens went up. And, of course, it was a mega night in Western Australia where it's fairly obvious they had anything to do with Liberal. The colour blue should be banned in Western Australia, as I'm sure the Emperor and now his Prime Minister might be able to do. And in Tasmania, Labor made a really stupid policy when it comes to the forestry industry and Tasmania, if it was paying attention in the final days. Well, it didn't buy into Labor, but it did buy into the Greens. So that's the first thing. Second one, and this cannot be mucked around with, it can't be talked down, it is the reality of the election. Women in Australia went hard left. They didn't go left, they went hard left. They went hard left when it came to the Teals, they went hard left when it comes to the Greens. Not all women, of course, there were people who voted Palmer and Hanson and Liberal and Labor, but come on. The actual sliding scale of this election was women 35, 55. We've talked about this for months. This was the baked-in part of the result. This was the part that was always going to be the case. And to give you an idea again, in the Resolve poll and Ipsos, it looked to this factor before the election. Now, obviously, we don't get results on who actually voted which way and what way because, of course, it's a secret ballot and all the rest of it. But the national vote, according to Resolve, for the Greens was 14, but for women, it was 19. In Ipsos, it was 10 overall, but for women, it was 16. So even if these numbers are off by 1 or 2 points, you can see that there is a higher proportion of support for the Greens among female voters. Another thing here, people love voting local. They love voting for a local mayor. They love voting for a local doctor. They love voting for insert local Olympian, former Olympian or hero. And this isn't just because of the Teals. This isn't to say that the MPs that lost weren't good locals, but part of the specific marketing that the independents were able to pull off was we are of here for here. Now, I don't believe it, but still, that's the reality. That message worked. And it is a message that, let's not muck around, also worked in Western Sydney because Di Lee of the community was the one who took a seat that the Labor Party took for granted at such an extent that they thought they could drop in a Sheila from Central Casting over from Scotland Island because the Northern Beaches wasn't good enough for her. But this phenomenon has been going on in Australian politics for a long time. Andrew Wilkie's been an MP for a long time, as has Bob Katter, who has been a local person standing up and going hard year after year. Rebecca Sharkey, it goes on and on. So while I think it's a good thing for the major political parties that they don't have to fight for the inner city votes because there's always more votes in the suburbs and the regions, essentially now, rich people have their own political party. What, of course, is the disappointing factor for those of you who thought that it would end up being a hung parliament and the Simon Says party would end up getting a say in anything. If the argument was you have to get rid of a moderate Liberal MP because they don't get the results that we need out of government, well, guess what? You just elected people who now are not needed to form government, which means they'll give great speeches on Radio National and stand in the parliament, and most likely all of them get re-elected at the next election. But they're not part of the government. They are literally passengers in the process. And that's great for those that are incredibly wealthy and able to not care what the result of government is. But the result of government will, in the next 3 years, have serious consequences for the people in the suburbs, for the locals in the suburbs. Meantime, One Nation won the Freedom Party vote. A lot of conversation about was it going to be Clive, was it going to be the Lib Dems, all the rest. Here are the actual numbers, okay? Nationally, One Nation up almost 2 points. United Australia Party almost got to 1 point, and Lib Dems basically went from nothing to 1.7. So, in my view, One Nation clearly wins. When you have a look at New South Wales, One Nation surged by 3.5%, which is a huge result for them to 4.8. Tens of millions of dollars. Palmer is at 4%. The Lib Dems were able to go from nothing to 2%. In Victoria, One Nation went up 2.7% to 3.7. They were second, though, to the UAP, who were also up at 4.8. And the Liberal Democrats was 2.7. The best state of all was Queensland. Now, right now, tonight, there is predictions on at least the ABC's computer thingy that Pauline Hanson is leading and can get that final Senate spot. Who knows exactly what ends up happening, but what an incredible feat, because not only would she be returned to the parliament, but there is a chance of a senator from New South Wales and a senator from South Australia coming to One Nation, putting them at a block of 4. Now, Labor plus Greens plus Lambie, the numbers might be irrelevant, but that shows a surge. There is a chance of a Palmer person coming up in the Senate, I think, in Victoria. As for South Australia, One Nation's vote was up 4%. In Tasmania, they were up as well, despite the fact the UAP was down and Western Australia is its own country. So, fifth and final for me. Where to for the Libs? Now, what the lefties want us to do is to tear ourselves apart for their very own amusement. They want us to pretend that somehow it's all over, it's all broken, it never happens again. Well, what did I tell you after 2019? No win is forever and no loss is forever. You know that in places like Queensland, you can go from a Tarago to government in one term. It might be 1, it might be 3, who knows? But the next 3 years are going to be really tough. I stand by everything I've said for the past 6 weeks. I firmly believe the result of the change of government is going to be higher inflation. The supply chain, because China is shut down, will get worse and interest rates will go through the roof. It's not being unkind. It's just I'm not going to play this game where supposedly one half of Australia or a third of Australia needs to go and play sook for the next 3 years. No way. We believe in things. We voted for what we believe in yesterday. We didn't get enough people to agree, and that means that we are powerless in terms of forming laws for the next 3 years. But we're not powerless in a free society. In a free society, you are allowed to question the government. No matter what newfangled ways they'll come at us, we fight. We fight every day, but we also have to be honest about what just happened, which was we just lost a fight. Badly. So a couple of, off the top of my head, early thoughts before we get into the machinations of what happens for the next 3 years and beyond. Number one, all politics is local, so please pick your candidates early. You have to find the local councillor, the local mayor, the local copper, all of these people, right? And tonight we've got a great guest on the show who's been doing this for a long time. But you don't pick them at 5 minutes to midnight, you pick them with 2 years to go. So you can run the other person down. That's what you do. You also need to pull your thumb out of your backside, Liberal Party, and start actually being competitive at local council elections. The problem with so many people on the right is they think the first game you play in politics is the grand final, where all you do is run for the Senate. Here's an idea first. Raise some money, become a local councillor, become a mayor, and then after a couple of terms have a crack at the state, and if that doesn't work out, a couple of years after that you have a crack at the federal. You don't start at the grand final. And if the party is in trouble, it's in trouble because it ignores what the Greens have done for 30 freaking years. And the Labor Party has been phenomenal at for a long period of time, and it's one of the reasons why they are particularly so strong at state government. Second one, focus on family. Now, family doesn't mean mum, dad 2.4. It can be anything. It can be two Sheilas, it can be two blokes and a dog, it can be an Islamic family who believe that their faith is more important than anything else. It can be it is not the family of a poster from 20 years ago. But focus on family, celebrate family. Say it's good to be a family. Say it's a good thing for your kids to be a family, to be part of a family. Also, don't be afraid to draw a contrast to Labor. Now, this is where I will touch a little bit on where things have been for the past couple of days, with people saying that, some sort of Goldilocks approach. We need to be a bit more this, we need to be a little less that, we need to be a little less this, we need to be a little bit more that. No. What you need to do at some point in time is draw a contrast to the Labor Party. Now, you can pick whatever that is, and that's for the people who are in the party to make the decision rather than making that decision tonight. But be a contrast. And you know what? You might lose the next election. But at least there is a very obvious choice, one versus the other. And finally, whoever the leader is, for God's sake, back them quickly. I had a couple of people come and talk to me who clearly were of a certain faction last night, trying to say this and trying to say that, and said, you know what? Pull your thumb out, back someone in, because the thing that the Liberal Party is great at is you being able to cross the floor. The thing that they're really bad at is letting everyone have an opinion on everything publicly. One of the very few things that I envy about the Labor Party is that they have a caucus system where Penny Wong had to pretend she was against gay marriage for 3 years. I'd like to see that on the Conservative side of politics. Because while at its fundamental, the free speech and the dissent is all part of the system, guess what it looks like to your political opponents? Weakness. Confusion. Crossing the floor is something that you should be able to do and not lose your space in the parliament. But if it becomes something you do to save your seat week after week after week, then it's going to cause problems for the overall team. So I repeat, welcome to the Resistance each and every night at 8 o'clock. Because we'll be here and we will never give up. Joining us now in the conversation is my Sky News colleague, none other than the great Andrew Bolt. We're here with my other Sky News colleague, the wonderful Corey Bernardi. queen of Thursday nights, but let's get her here for the Sunday night, none other than Bronwyn Bishop. And the lady that I was talking about before, who knows how it works, back in local. Head of Local Government Association, of course, Labor to wear bootstraps, Linda Scott. Linda, I start with you firstly. Congratulations. What does it feel like after the 9 years of wilderness that it all worked out and it's all yours now?
Well, look, Paul Murray, there's not many days in a Labor person's life where you get to wake up under a new Labor government. So I have to say, I know many people around this table, and I'm sure many people watching are hurting today, but it feels really great to have a Labor government. But lots of challenges ahead, and I do want to take the opportunity to thank Scott Morrison. He did an extraordinary job as Prime Minister. I'm sure he's having a hard day today with his family. I've worked with him as the head of the Local Government Association, and I do want to send my best wishes to him. Elections are choices, but they're challenging for those and their family members who are in them.
Well said. Let's go around the table. Andrew, your response to my observations.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, for a start, the Liberals have got to stop apologising for their past, their this, their that. Stop swinging with the wind. And I think they've got to take a leaf from the Greens. The Greens never got intimidated by losing. I mean, they've never won an election in terms of a majority government. But they have seeded the ground. They have preached, they have prepared, they have gone into the education system, they have prepared a generation to vote for them. They've taken the long view. They have not been intimidated by being in a minority in the way that the Liberals so often have. The Liberals have got to revert to what their foundation beliefs are, like freedom of the individual, treating people as individuals, not as members of a tribe, and preach it. And to be not afraid. Be not afraid of the ABC. Be not afraid of being in a minority. Don't feel intimidated. Use this position to prepare for a better Liberal Party in the future. But this idea that you've got to, now, like Simon Birmingham today, we better be more like the Labor Party, I'm paraphrasing here. No. Be more like yourself. Prepare for the hits, but prepare to win.
Well, also, dare I say, perhaps the creative solution is to say, you know what our solution is when it comes to emissions? Nuclear power. And you could take it to an election and people like it or they don't like it, Bronwyn. But let's focus in on you. Your old seat in Mackellar that you represented so well for so long.
22 years.
Is now in the hands of others. What does it say about the change in the areas? Because they make their choice, that's it. It's as right as they were to back you, they've decided to back what they do now. There is no Liberal MP from North Head to South Head, all the way to Palm Beach.
Correct.
What does it say?
For me, it was enormously disappointing because it's a 1949 seat. The three members, or the two members before me and myself, we'd all been ministers, and I'd won 8 elections. And to see it fall was personally very hard. Now, lots of reasons. Maybe they thought they liked having a female member. They got used to it. But seriously, I think one of the things, and I've said it on your program again and again, what a mistake it was to abrogate the area of climate change, where we had one election after election after election. And even with the Teals, we couldn't fight back because we'd sort of abrogated it. It become neutral. And it was such a powerful thing. Now, you said nuclear. We've got 300 years of coal here. The rest of the world wants it. We have to sell it. And we need baseload power. It doesn't matter what anybody else says. You can have electricity coming from renewables, so-called renewables, but you have to have baseload. And we abandoned that argument, and yet it was so forceful and powerful in other elections.
Well, I'm going to put a pin in it because that's one of the big ones that deserves its whole own section that we'll get to in a second, right? Because I've got a bit to say about it. Corey, your thoughts. Again, your party in South Australia, there were reliable things that you could hold on to, like Boothby, like Senate numbers, and then even potentially places like Sturt. What do you think about what I just said about the start there? about how the reality is that, yes, you've got to take the loss on the chin, but we're not going to sit around and sook and throw the toys out of the cot or pretend we're not in the fight anymore. We are in the fight for millions of people who yesterday voted for that fight.
Paul, I think you've gone a bit soft, to be honest. The reflection on this campaign, from my perspective, reminds me why I left the Liberal Party. I mean, let's go through this just quickly. John Howard used to win election after election because he was a man of conviction. He was seen as someone who believed in something and had the best interest of the country at heart. When he lost, Tony Abbott won it back. He was very good in opposition, to the point, focused on traditional Liberal values and principles, won a great victory, then was trounced by Malcolm Turnbull. Turnbull hemorrhaged 1 million votes for the Liberal Party, and we were going to hemorrhage another 1 million until Scott Morrison came in and was the great white hope of the side, because people thought there's a values-based politician. The problem is the last 3 years have been completely wasted. I know the pandemic was in there, but they implemented basically green policies. We had a universal basic income through JobKeeper and JobSeeker. You had the government interfering in the private sector. You had them trampling over property rights. They did nothing to stop the state premiers getting out of control. And in fact, they brought them in and made them equivalents at National Cabinet. They screwed up the budget. They all of these things, and people are going, hang on, what sort of a government have we elected here? And I hate to break this to you, people started to turn off. The Greens, as far as I could see, did next to no national campaign at all, and basically the whole sales job of the Greens policy about big government intervention, looking after you, stopping business and stuff, was implemented by this government. It wasn't opposed by Labor. I think there's an existential crisis in the Liberal Party coming. Andrew made the point, quite rightly, to be yourself. The big problem is the people who come in when they win government are basically a bunch of show ponies who want to prance around and are Labor or left-green Liberals. When they lose, they all lose their seats, and the party becomes a good party in opposition because it goes to these values. But it's a cycle, rinse and repeat. So instead of being on the political stage, some of these clowns should just go back to musical theatre or whatever they do in their day jobs, because honestly, they actually do a disservice. Right? And the Liberal Party needs to say, well, let's go to the suburbs. Matt Canavan's on the right money. Let's go to the suburbs. Let's represent Tony's tradies or Howard's battlers or the blue-collar workers, the families, all of that stuff. If you want your teals and your hard lefties in the inner suburbs, hey, you can have them, because that's not a centre-right conservative position to take.
Well, sure,
that's pretty hardcore. But
the thing is
anyway,
that,
I've got it out.
No. But the thing is that we might come at the conclusion from different realities, different ideas, but the conclusion's the same, right? There was an interesting piece, and understandably, I haven't read many of the hot takes in the past 24 hours, but one of them was an electoral analyst for the Australian Financial Review, who said that actually the Liberal Party, one of the constituencies that actually lifted its vote in was in welfare-dependent communities. So you had a scenario where, obviously, there was a breakup with the big end of town, but there was, in some parts of Australia, a movement back towards inroads being made from the Liberals there. But before we get again to the philosophical stuff, and look, it's not that it's not important, but it is, we are doing a television show, and endless conversations about, conservative philosophy may well be a little bit sleepy, even on a Sunday night, okay? But I do want to talk about candidate selection, because, Linda, I know I'm going to embarrass you, but you are very good at this. And the Labor Party is very good at this, about identifying somebody and having a system to put them through. You had some big wins out as a result of that last night, didn't you?
Well, look, there were mayors running for Labor, and those who did run for Labor did extremely well. So it is the case, of course, that over in Western Australia, Tracy, the Mayor of Wanneroo, has had an extraordinary swing to her, and she'll now be the new MP for Pearce. We were running Jerome Laxale in Bennelong, and that looks tight, but he may well fall over the line. Again, a 6.9% swing, quite extraordinary. And of course, Matt Burnett up in Gladstone, my very good friend, who, even though he may not win that seat, it's clear he had an extraordinary swing to him. But I don't want to pull out that this is on one side of politics. In the South Australian election recently, we saw Sam Telfer elected to the Liberal government there, the Liberal opposition. We've seen, I think, a lot of high-profile local candidates, and Di Lee is another one. She's former member of the Liberal Party, now an independent, who have been elected on the basis of being a strong local voice. And you could almost have the same slogan for all of them. They're people who know their community. Paulie, I would argue they're at the highest level of government in local government, of course, and then they're making a decision to, go to another level of government, less local, disappointing. But nevertheless, I think that candidate selection in this election was incredibly important, and the concept of selecting candidates early, selecting them in a way that was democratic and they had the support of their local people, clearly was critically important.
But also, Bronwyn, I mean, the thing is that, look, we're not going to muck around with it. The Liberal Party absolutely screwed it, particularly in New South Wales. And in part the way they screwed it was because the right was fighting with the left, and every time the right screwed the left screwed the right backwards, some bloke goes to court. This could have been solved 12 months ago, but it was intentionally being disrupted. And believe me, while we talk tonight, tomorrow I start talking about the New South Wales government. Matt Keane, get ready for your own graphic. You're getting the marshmallow treatment. All right, so what about that, about who we pick to run for Parliament?
Well, when I was president of the party, I actually was one who really supported running candidates for local government. Traditionally, the Liberal Party didn't do it. We used to have Liberal independents. But it made sense to me that we would take part in local government. It's still argued about in the Liberal Party. But nonetheless, choosing people with a high profile, people who stand for something, people who are involved in the community, or someone to whom they feel drawn. If someone's going to come in. I mean, when I was pre-selected, I actually lived in the adjoining electorate of Warringah, but I simply said I wanted to move up the road. And I had a lot of connections, and that was successful. And I did involve myself very much in the community. So that's spot on. You have to do it. All politics is local was the great catch cry of a former Speaker of the United States Senate. But there's something else I think that's very important. We also said all along that McGowan was going to run the campaign in Western Australia. He won those 4 seats. And the fact of the matter is that the wipeout in Western Australia in the state election, where they were left with 2 members, was all because they too said, we'll go green and we'll go for climate change. Wipeout. Yeah. So you just can't do it. You can't be a pale imitation of your opponent and expect your opponent not to win.
Okay, but here's the thing. This is the preview of the climate conversation, right? But I want to talk about Albo as PM, all the rest of it. Andrew, here's the thing. I understand, and I am not advocating that the party becomes more lefty, all the rest of it, right? But here's the deal. The Liberal Party lost 0 seats yesterday to anyone who was saying dump net zero. They lost 5 to people who want 60% action on climate change by 2030.
Correct.
How do you square that circle?
Well, also I point out that the Nationals, which has been the most recalcitrant party when it comes to global warming, didn't lose any seats. The
Absolutely.
Liberals lost a poultice.
Yeah, fair point.
But obviously they represent different constituencies. But the thing here is, a lot of Liberals will be saying, and this is not just the global warming issue. It goes to other issues too, whether it's, that we're not taking the women's problem serious and all that kind of stuff. And the problem with the Liberals is they didn't have the courage to put their arguments. Now, on global warming, Matt Canavan does, but the Liberals don't.
Correct.
And if you do that, you cannot win an argument if you haven't put it in the first place. And the Liberals just think, well, look, we'll go, I'm their leader and I must follow them. I mean, you can't set the terms of the agenda that way. And the problem with global warming is this. When you do what the Liberals have done, first under Turnbull and now under Morrison, is when you say, oh, well, look, maybe we should, global warming is actually a big problem after all. It is really dangerous and we should, after all, commit to net zero. What you're in fact saying is, we were wrong. We were wrong about something that we now accept could wipe out your kids, but we now see the light and we will do what Labor says, but we won't do it as fast as Labor. I mean, how does it work? You've in fact legitimised all the criticisms of the Teal independents, of Labor, of the Greens, but you've said, even though I now see the problem, even though I've been wrong all that time, I'm not going to do what they're going to do to save you. And I don't know how the Liberals thought they could get away with a message like that.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I'm going to be playing sort of devil's advocate as much in this conversation as anything, right? But Corey, again,
Paul.
No, but hang on.
Okay.
But Corey, again, right? So times change, things move on. Now, I can't stand the idea that the big end of town has decided to go in this direction, but if that's where capital is, that's where every state government is, how do you fight against it? I'm not arguing I'm saying, how do you fight against it here, Corey?
Okay. Well, you know what? You've actually got to make the position, as Andrew mentioned. You've got to have the courage of your conviction to argue it. How did the Liberal Party continue to win those seats for the last decade during these climate wars? The problem is we've got people who have capitulated in all this space. And we could go not just in global warming space, but Andrew's exactly right. They've admitted that basically they have been wrong for all this time, and you know when you try and appease a lefty, the only thing they do is move the front line somewhere else a bit further, and they try and slice a bit more. You can never ever appease them. And that's why I was incredulous, for example, when the Prime Minister decided to give extra money to the ABC. Was that what, to try and buy some favourable balanced coverage during the election campaign? Because it certainly didn't come. But why didn't the Liberals, for example, halve the budget of the ABC? Why didn't they do the things, embrace nuclear power when they reviewed the EPBC Act? They've been too timid, too cowardly. They've been frozen in the headlights. And I just look back on this last 3 years, and unfortunately I think it's been actually a wasted 3 years because there was no vision. And if you ask me what the campaign was about, until the last week of the campaign, I didn't know what a Liberal Party policy was, to be honest. The superannuation policy, gave them a boost, it gave them a buoyance, and they did it in the housing superannuation because it reflected true Liberal principles. Every other day of the campaign was a bauble for you, a trinket for you, a handout for you, and you know what? None of it said to me they would know what an agenda is for the next 100 days or the first 100 days of the next term, or for the hope and prosperity of this country going forward. That, I think, was the terrible mistake.
So we're going to get to what a Labor government...
I don't think we should overlook something else, though. I don't think we should overlook something else, though, Paul. It's sort of an elephant in the room. Let's face facts. A lot of people just didn't like Scott Morrison. And a lot of those people were Liberals as well. And it's been a problem with this presentation for a long time. You know, this idea, you know how he talks very fast and doesn't take a breath so you can't be interrupted. It's like a guy that was always scared of being interrupted because he wasn't quite confident in what he was saying. That's one of the reasons, you know, the bulldozer thing came out. They didn't like him. Now, I thought a lot of the knock against him was actually fraudulent, like he doesn't like women or something like that. I thought it was a complete beat up. It was a stitch up. It was a hate session. But the fact is, a lot of people just didn't like Scott Morrison, which is why I suggested in February, a bit too late because, things were as they were, that Scott Morrison should make way for Peter Dutton. That might have probably made it worse in the short term, but they weren't going to vote for Scott Morrison. Full stop.
Well, but they didn't want to vote.
That's the way it was.
They didn't want to vote for Albanese either. That was quite clear, and that's why they voted all over the shop.
But Albanese is Prime Minister, and Scott Morrison is not. Slight difference.
Which brings about a good discussion about why do we have compulsory preferential voting anymore? Why do we have people being elected when they get less votes than somebody who is defeated? So I have to be honest.
Well, and it works both ways, and you're not going to change it, Bronwyn.
Well, I'm sorry.
You're not going to change it. Just face, look.
It was a miracle 3 years ago.
You've got to win by these rules.
I'm sorry. No, that's not right. In New South Wales, there is optional preferential voting. In the Senate, there is optional preferential voting. There is no reason whatsoever why we can't have optional preferential voting federally. And I've got to be honest, when I was Shadow Special Minister of State, I proposed it. I went around the states and discussed it, and it was knocked on the head for a reason I could never quite understand.
How's that going to sound? You think, we lost this, the Liberals lost this election, so how about we now propose a rule that'll make it easier for us to win next time? Look, you might be right. You might have right on your side.
That's what Labor does in Queensland.
It's something to get the Liberals out of this.
I guess the point I'm making more is that you have to have considered plans about how you do things. If we'd done it when I wanted to do it, it would have been okay to do. So there are going to be a lot of things that you've got to plan to introduce gradually along the chain. But don't knock them out because you think somebody might argue against it. If it's the right thing to do, and there are a big case you could make out for why it's right, don't knock it on the head and say we can't do it.
All right, now we're going to talk about.
I'll just tell you that people are going to say you're trying to rig the rules to stay in power.
I'm not saying do it tomorrow, Andrew.
No,
I'm not saying tomorrow.
I'm not telling you what I think. Well, it doesn't matter. We're raising it now. You want to raise this agenda. I'm just telling you how the Greens and the Teals and all that will interpret it, and they'll have a point. And I think what they really need to do is Liberals, what the hell do you stand for? You talk about
I agree with
let's get mayors and former mayors and all that. All this is good. All this is good. But the problem is when you've got power, what do you want to do with it?
Oh, absolutely.
And a collection of mayors, no matter how good they are, might not actually know what to do with the power.
Yeah, but you know I'm not pretending
a lot
that
of
that's
people
not
look
the
at the
case.
Morrison government. A lot of people look at the Morrison government's time in office and will think, hey, that was just like the Fraser years. Wasted. What did you do with it? You had the power. You didn't reform the ABC. You didn't fight for your values. You didn't advance individual freedom. You didn't advance free speech. You didn't. You made government bigger, not smaller. I mean, what did you actually do with the power?
All right, I'm going to take a quick break. No, everyone doesn't get the last say. I have to take a break because I ain't the ABC. All right, let's take a break. Back in a second, and I'm going to talk about what's going to happen to the country now that National Cabinet can happen on WhatsApp. More in a sec. John Anderson, Michael Kroger, Senator Jim Molan, future Senator Jacinta Price, all ahead. But right now, what a crackerjack panel. Think of this as just a barbecue you get to watch on television without the food, without the beers, but with all of the opinions. None other than Andrew Bolt with Corey Bernardi, with Bronwyn Bishop, with Linda Scott. All right. Now, I want to talk about how I think it plays out for Albo in the first little while. I stand by all of my predictions when it comes to inflation, interest rates, all of that. But here's the deal. I think the easy plays for Albo are because there are so many Labor states and essentially COAG, National Cabinet, whatever. I think that what he's going to turn around and do is he is going to do 10-year funding arrangements on hospitals and schools and all these sorts of things that essentially end the state blame game code, give the Labor states whatever they want, and then you get the credit for changing the system. I also think that when times get tough, we are going to be distracted by year-long conversations about what's in the Constitution, which doesn't mean those things don't need to be dealt with, but it's just get ready for the break glass in case of emergency, of inflation, of interest rates. Let's talk about our place in the world. Corey, what do you think of that as an early playbook for how I think they're going to go?
I hadn't thought about the funding deal, but it makes a lot of sense because it also ties the hands of any potential challenger later on. I do think that there's going to be some tough economic times ahead. Now, they are not going to be created by Labor. Labor may exacerbate them and make them slightly worse, but there are factors in the global marketplace that are going to affect us here. And that will distract people. You're only allowed to indulge in climate change malarkey when the economy is going along okay. When things get really tight, it's going to be a problem. And so they will want a distraction. The other thing, we're just talking about the climate change again for a second. Let's just say that Albanese does something to appeal these teal independents or whatever. They're going to drive even more wedges and difficulties into our economy. And that's going to remind people again that this is a really dumb thing to do. So I do think they're caught in a bit of a bind, but Labor, they will be able to spin their way out of anything. They will throw money as far and wide as it needs to go in order to prop up their position. And it'll be in a worse place, Australia, in 3 or 4 years' time than it is today. But it's going to be what degree of margin, Paul?
But what about those things, Linda? Because obviously local council becomes part of that process as well. I just think as a strategy for look how good we done, and also to tie the hands of future governments. This is the play. Try and do the 10-year deals. You're able to basically, with the opposition of New South Wales, which is a lefty Liberal state anyway, Tasmania, new Premier, you can run the table on everything from, and this is what I talked about with the stroke of the pen, people. This is not the sookie bit, this is just the bit I told you about. With the stroke of a pen, with regulation, you can change a country. And if they want to change the national curriculum, they can do it, and they can do it via WhatsApp. You don't even have to have a meeting. So, from your perspective, do you like the idea that now, with essentially all of it of one colour, that if you don't fix the problems, who else can you blame?
Well, look, I'm looking forward to playing my part on the National Cabinet as part of the Local Government Association, representing for the first time in a long time the voice of 537 local governments. We do so much on the ground every day, and not incorporating that voice into the National Cabinet when it was before that on COAG was, I think, a big mistake from the former Prime Minister, and I'm pleased to see that the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has rectified it. I think it is an important forum because only through working across all three levels of government can actually we all together deliver for Australians. I mean, at the local government level, Paul, I don't walk around and hear people saying, you know what, I want more from my elected representatives? I want them to fight and disagree more. I really want them. That's not what Australians are saying.
Fights.
What they're saying
like part of the Labor strategy, sorry, but I'm going to say this right. This is the only bit that might get a little bit sooky, which is a very effective Labor strategy. I have never in the history of Australia seen the local premier play such an aggressive role in an election campaign. You're standing next to the leader, fine. But this miserable government, get rid of this miserable, taking out ads in Melbourne, standing all day, every day in Queensland, being an active daily part of the campaign in Western Australia.
That's the politics of an election. I had on
They were doing it for years before the election.
I had on my booth a nurse talking to me in tears about how difficult it has been to work on the front line for the last few years and how they just simply couldn't get recruitment happening for the staff they needed to replace the staff.
And all those new nurses are coming from overseas.
I had family members crying again to me on polling day about the need to fix aged care. The people in Australia voted for change because they want these problems solved. They don't want a system of government where people stand back and bash each other at different levels of government. No. It's boring. It doesn't help anybody. It's utterly useless.
It's no good crying out for kumbaya. It just doesn't work.
No, it's not kumbaya. This is party discipline. And Labor now has total control.
It's okay when Labor bashes. It's okay when Labor bashes Liberals, but it's not okay when Liberals fight back against Labor's policies.
We have completely different philosophical stances, and we will see the socialist agenda emerge. Watch.
That's what I said about the stroke of the pen.
And the other things that we said, I haven't changed my mind about all the things I've said either. Yeah. And I said elevating those premiers to the equal of the Prime Minister was nuts. And that's exactly what allowed them. We said McGowan would campaign for Western Australia and that Albanese wouldn't have to do a thing. And that's exactly what's transpired.
So my point is, Andrew, which is it's a brilliant electoral strategy, right? The Aussie Joe Biden play, it worked. But now let's get to the bit where, just like Joe Biden had full control of the American government, Labor has full control of the Australian levers of power. They've made some promises. They've set some expectations. I get it. Nobody got a pay rise today, but if we're still having a conversation in a year and not enough people have got a pay rise, guess who's going to cop it? And they can't blame anyone else.
Well, I think they will be able to blame someone else. Not that they won't want to, but they will have someone to blame. And that is because the Labor government will not be able to get anything through the Senate unless the Greens agree.
Exactly.
Unless it's the Liberals. It's either the Liberals or the Greens. Well, obviously, the Liberals will step in if it's a serious national security. There's no value in the Liberals opposing this. But basically, for the radical agenda, Labor needs the Greens. Otherwise, there's no other way of getting it through the Senate.
Yep.
So they're tied together. And so I don't think he has much authority, really. This is the problem. We have a parliament that's going to be all accelerator and no brake to Labor's worst instincts. So even if Labor did want to think, we better inflation's getting really out of control. Interest rates are really rising terribly, and we really need to pull back this spending. How do you think that's going to happen? Right? So this is the real issue here. I don't know that the Albanese government has much authority. I mean, we're also talking about a moral authority. It was support. It was, 2 out of 3 Australians didn't even vote for this government.
Correct.
And Albanese himself, I think, is a man that lacks a little authority.
Final thoughts from all of you. Corey, I'll start with you. Anything you haven't mentioned thus far that is a hot take before we say goodnight?
I just think the Liberals, quite frankly, need to provide some accountability in this. That's the one thing they've done terribly over the years, is actually hold people to account for the decisions and determinations that have been there. And it's not just the PM, it's across the board. There are people who really need to reconsider what their commitment to politics should be.
Linda?
Well, I completely disagree with this entire panel, as you'd expect, and really think this was an enormous climate election. It's in Labor's political interest if this disagreement continues, but actually it's not in the national interest. And if people around here, and more importantly, the elected Liberals and Nationals who continue to serve, don't hear that message from the Australian people, I fear for our future. Well, you need to unite around the big national challenges, like the fact that climate change is real and happening, and you need to have policies to address them and to make sure the economy can grow at the same time. And just denying that, just wrecking it, just being destructive is the wrong approach for the future.
Andrew, your final thought?
Well, Linda, the easy way of uniting around an issue is for you to agree with me. I mean, why must I agree with you? It's always the way, let's all unite, but you have to unite around me. Now, the thing is about the global warming thing, the Liberals have never made the argument, and therefore you cannot win that argument on climate change. But reality and facts have their own way of settling the argument for you. Example, look at Britain. There was only, last year that the Prime Minister there, Boris Johnson, was raving about global warming. It was the biggest global warming cheerleader in the world at that conference in Glasgow. Fast forward, less than a year, power prices through the roof. Gas shortages, electricity shortages. Suddenly he's running away from that at 1 million miles an hour. Reality has its own logic. Reality has its own convincing power. And I would suspect that 3 years from now, electricity prices are a real issue. Electricity shortages are a real issue. And suddenly, a lot of people who voted green and global warming because they didn't hear the other argument for a start, and they thought it was very fashionable and nice and a way to show they're good, are going to think, good God, no one told us it would cost this. And that's when the Liberals have an argument to make.
Yeah, exactly. Bronwyn, last one.
We should have been making that argument all the time. The fact of the matter is the job of the government and the job of the opposition is to talk about keeping this country in good order, in serving the people so that they can prosper. Now that means you've got to have energy which is ready and available all the time. The reason, Linda, you can say that this was a climate change election that you won is because we didn't bother to fight it. We abrogated, we got out of the picture. And you can't do that. You've got to stand up for the things that you believe in, and you can't go from one day saying, I'm a man holding up a lump of coal, look, don't be afraid of it, and then saying nil emissions by 2050. It just doesn't gel. Now, Morrison did good stuff while he was Prime Minister. Credit where credit's due. He did some very good stuff. But the fact of the matter is, when it came to a real fight, you've got to have something to fight for. You can't just say, look, I've done well. Look at my record and vote me in. You have to give people something to fight for. And those Teal people walked in. There was nothing to fight against them with because we'd abrogated
and I'll give you
our
the tip.
argument.
They're not going anywhere for a long
It's true. Once they get in, it's very hard to get rid of them.
Correct. One and all, thank you very much. That was fun. I look forward to continuing the chat because we've got 2 hours on the telly. Andrew back tomorrow night, 7 o'clock in his own show. Make sure you're there in the front row, and then we're straight after him then. We're also, in a second, going to have a chat with the former Deputy Prime Minister, John Anderson, Michael Kroger, and a whole lot more. Don't go to bed. 2 hours of Paul Murray Live tonight on Sky News. The resistance has begun. Let's continue the chat, the uncomfortable conversation that must happen when your team loses a grand final, and what a way they lost. Michael Kroger joins us now from Melbourne. John Anderson, of course, former Deputy Prime Minister. So, Michael, put simply, I laid out some things at the start of the show. You may well have missed it, but it was like about future of Liberal Party, all the rest of it. We'll get into all this existential stuff in a second. But let's deal with the reality. The government has changed. How do you think the country has changed for the next 3 years? I talk about how the easy wins for Albo are doing deals with the states. I also should add that I think he's going to do, wage accord, 10-year deals with sort of big business, big unions, big government. But how do you think the joint will change over the next 3 years?
So I think it'll change radically. Albo's come in with all of the usual governing for everybody mantra that we hear from every newly elected president or prime minister. Even those that didn't vote for us, we're representing them. Blah blah blah. Unity. And he'll believe this stuff, and he'll think he's incredibly popular, and he'll try and keep peace within the Labor Party because he's a lefty turn to the right, etc., etc. He'll think he's an incredibly popular, successful Labor Prime Minister, and he'll have learned from Gillard, Rudd, etc., until he gets hit by the economic reality stick. And that will hit him hard. And what it will be, mate, is successive interest rate rises. And I would think next year, that's 2023, towards the end of 23, there'll be a severe world recession for all the reasons that we know. And his government will very quickly evaporate, and his leadership will too, because he will have no idea how to handle it, nor will his team. And I think Australia's going to be in for a very difficult period in 2023 and 2024, and they've got the wrong man at the helm.
John, can I just ask a mechanical question? When you win government, when you become the Deputy Prime Minister, the process, because obviously you've played the politics, you covered the job. Tell me about the first 2 weeks of when you assume such high office. What happens, and are there moments where even your preparedness for the moment, you are hit by the enormity of the task?
Well, you're certainly hit. Good to be with you and with Michael. Certainly hit by the enormity of the task. And when we went into government, we'd been in opposition for a long time. And the only people who had experience in government around the cabinet table were John Howard and John Moore. The rest of us were on a very, very steep learning curve. Could I just step back for a moment, though? It seems to me the first question we should be asking, and, look, credit where credit is due. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister. He deserves it. He's formed government in the House of Representatives. As has been pointed out, it must be very worrying for him that less than 1 in 3 Australians actually wanted him to be Prime Minister. But what is it about Australia at this point in time when we face massive challenges that there's a strange reluctance to engage with the really big issues that confront us all, many of them external dangers, external enemies even to our future freedom and prosperity, that sees us squabbling with one another as though we're the problem, our fellow Australians. That's point one. Point two, I am fond of saying you can't get good public policy without a good debate. Now, on these major issues, we're told that climate change is a very big one. I'm not so sure that it plays so heavily in all of Australia. Look, the National Party retained all of its seats.
Absolutely.
Worth pointing out. And it's painted as a dinosaur on this issue. Now, I'm a farmer. I'm worried about volatility in seasons. It does concern me. I don't take this lightly. But we'll never get the public policy settings right in Australia if we don't agree the facts first. The first fact we have to deal with is that we know from the research that Australians, probably because of the rhetoric that is so freely thrown around, believe that we are responsible for 10 to 20% of the world's emissions. I mean, it's extraordinary. Right. It's actually 1.1, 1.2, and as a proportion of global emissions coming down. Most people don't know that. Next point, we're told to accept the science. Well, the former chief scientist, Alan Finkel, a man I have an enormous regard for, acknowledged in a Senate response to a question recently that no matter what we do in this country, we can't have a significant impact. That's not to say we shouldn't be active, but we need to actually face the reality. We are not the major problem here. The next thing we need to get on with is to say that adaptation is going to be important, that technology is going to be important, that we cannot and should not risk our economic, and fuel security and defence intertwined, if you like, responsibilities of the Commonwealth Government to look after us all. And here's a final point as a farmer, whether we like it or not. I heard the earlier useful comments about what's happened in Britain, where they've changed direction so quickly, as has Germany, a left-of-centre government with a Green foreign minister acknowledging that they have to go back, on their green policies. Only 12% of Germany's energy, despite being the greenest of the Western nations, is now generated by renewables, and they've got to retreat even from that. Let me make another point. The Bank of England is warning of global food catastrophe issues by the end of this year. We cannot produce food without reliable and copious quantities of affordable diesel and gas. Half the world's grain production is dependent upon nitrogen as urea, produced overwhelmingly from gas. We have to deal with the cards that are on our table and drop the high emotion and be honest with one another about what we can and can't do, and to balance these things up. I'm really concerned that we're not, as a nation, prepared to engage with the things that threaten us all.
Michael, it feels like whenever you either have an improbable victory or a tight victory, whatever it happens to be you a minority government or a surprise government, that what ends up seeping into things is that you feel like you're only there just, which means you triage things for 3 years rather than make the most of your numbers to try to do something, let alone the compromises that have to be made in the Senate. For coalition governments, that was essentially, relatively conservative crossbench, but there could be poison pills dropped in by a Jackie Lambie who looks like she's got a second person at a Tassie, all the rest of it. So Albanese's going to be in this position where at the best case scenario tonight, it's 77, but it's most likely 76, and that's with, everything falling their way. How do you make the big changes? Is Labor able to do that because they have caucus discipline? They don't have the scenario like the Religious Freedom Bill where 4 people can run away and then it's all dead on day one?
Mate, absolutely. It's much easier for them in the reps to get legislation through because they'll get every vote for it and none against and no abstentions, because we know what happens if people don't vote that way. But then, of course, it gets to the Senate and who knows what that dog's breakfast will look like in a couple of weeks' time. It's going to be incredibly messy. And for Labor to put together a majority vote, they'll obviously need the Greens, and then good luck after that. So, we are in for a difficult legislative time with a number of us had said on Sky, some of us have been criticised for it, but I'm of the view I'd prefer the Albanese government to be a majority than having to deal with this mishmash of independents. I prefer Alban to get to 76, not 74.
I agree with you.
Thanks, John. Look, you don't want a country where no one knows what will happen in the reps with any legislation, and no one knows what that'll happen in the Senate. This is a recipe for paralysis in this country, and quickly the foreign capital markets will look at Australia and downgrade us. So let's hope Albo gets to 76 because we can't get there. But in answer to your question, Paul, it's going to be a long, slow process because no one has any idea how things will go in the Senate.
Oh, look, I agree completely I want governments to be majority governments so they can get on with it. In the case of the Liberal Party, you want them to have bigger majorities, so those that want to, make a protest, all the rest of it, they can go somewhere else and you at least still get a way to get through. As soon as you end up dead level, one in front, then of course everyone can become sort of the political suicide bomber. But John, back to that fundamental point, right? And I love having this bit of the conversation. Not as fiery as the normal show and all the rest of it, but it's really it's the main meal, right?
Yeah.
Which is our politics has played at such a volume and at such a pace, left, right, centre, media, all the rest of it, right? It feels like it is impossible to have a complicated conversation because if you try to put forward the nuanced
that's right.
difference, somehow that's you taking the same side as the most extreme person who has no idea what they're talking about.
Exactly. This is a great problem with identity politics where we've tribalised and we have divorced the idea of virtue and character from our assessment of another person, and we attach it now to ideas. So if you agree with my ideas, you're a good person, you're virtuous. If you don't, you ought to be silenced. You ought to be cut out of the scene. And we're throwing away the capacity to find consensus, and you cannot get good public policy out of a bad debate. That's why I dwelt for a moment on climate. We're getting very bad debate and a lot of standoff because we're not confronting the real limitations of what we can do, as well as, or the real possibilities of what we can do, and how we really seek to be good global citizens. An obvious point being, we can help feed a world that's facing a global food crisis, but it means we have to be realistic about the fact that we need a lot of fossil fuel energy to do it. That's a moral cause in its own right, and it needs to be recognised as not being. So you're absolutely right. This is one of the great problems of, the 30-second grab, which is now morphed into addiction to social media, where the sort of the spontaneous, the clever wit, the nastiness outweighs clever, considered, proper debate. And the nation is the loser. And, I was on the polling booth yesterday, and a very nice and agreeable and intelligent young Australian came up to me. And he said, I don't know how to vote. Can you give me some ideas of what the issues are? So my point is more that he's a victim. I don't like using that word. He should step up a bit, I'll say that. But of the culture we live in, how does he get information? How does he actually understand when you have a federal election debate in Australia in the most dangerous economic and strategic environment the country has ever lived in, and we've fought about everything internally that we can disagree on and not focused on the things that we ought to be able to agree on in terms of our national freedoms and moving forward. You've hit the nail on the head. We have a crisis in terms of our ability to find the right language, the right means to talk properly. And I've noticed the dumbing down of the parliament. There are still notable exceptions. But when I went in, there were people on both sides who had deeply held philosophical worldviews that were very impressive with a real ability to put them. So they'd have an idea of what sort of Australia they wanted, and they could evaluate each policy setting against that long-term vision. Well, no one has that long-term vision anymore now, so we get this sort of short-term ad hocery, on-the-run opportunism, which is, of course, only fed the cynicism, I think, in the Australian community. I'm deeply worried about that cynicism, and I'm deeply worried about the potential for division. I was looking at Jason Falinski's numbers, thinking vastly more people actually in his seat wanted him returned than wanted the other person. But you've had, of course, the independents play these funny games. They tell us they've got the only vision for Australia, but it turns out that it's just more important for them to group together and get rid of a member that the majority of people in that seat still want. Well, those are Liberals who a lot of them will feel very cheated by that, There'll be a lot of discontent. We're going down the Trump style of, let me rephrase that, the American road to division, where people decry President Trump or President Biden without recognising that they are products of the division that we've allowed to dominate in the name of identity politics.
So, Michael, obviously, again, while I host a TV show, this is my forum to be able to do it. I don't want to fall into the immediate trap that the left wants, which is a long circular conversation by one side of politics about what it needs to do to win an election, right? Because all of that means you're not focused on attacking the opponent and winning the next election, right? But given what John just said about the fact that at any election there can be scenarios where the majority, by a huge margin, 10, 20% of the electorate basically gets ganged up on by the rest of it to get a result, which doesn't mean I'm sooking about the system. That is the system. But how do you keep Liberals enthused if it feels like the other guys have worked out the system now and this is our permanent place?
Yeah. No offence to them. They know how the arguments work and they're doing a lot better at it than us. I mean, let's be frank. We didn't have a convincing case for a fourth term agenda, and you need one. After 9 years, you've got to explain to people why it's absolutely urgent you get another 3. We weren't able to do that and we lost. Good management is not a powerful narrative. It is not an inspiring narrative. It doesn't get the base. I don't see people at meetings saying, yes, we are the party of good management. Let's fight the barricades for that. Whereas the left, who are arguing for global warming, we're going to save the planet from, the global warming fires that are coming and the rising sea levels, and you can play a role in protecting the planet for your children and grandchildren, is a much more romantic notion than, we're good managers, like, good public servants. I mean, that's not an agenda for going forward. And so what the Liberal Party needs to do is not game the system, but give inspiration to its supporters and not fall into the trap, by the way, of, this nonsense argument that, should it go right, should it go left, what should it do, the moderates are gone and the right will take over and that evil Peter Dutton, blah, 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 who'll be an exceptionally good leader, by the way, if he becomes leader of the Liberal Party. Dutton has been an outstanding minister and is a quality politician, and he'll be the leader and he will surprise everybody. But if you had a massive campaign as one of the Liberal Party's core policies to save small business, to save Middle Australia from the strangling regulation that we have in this country today, to energise our base by saying to every small businessman or woman, tell us how, through a Royal Commission, how can we make running your business easier, get the states on board to increase productivity and profitability in this country and employment by slashing the regulation, which is killing every small business in this country, the registrations, the licences, the feeds, the compliance, etc. I saw Macquarie Bank, by the way, which is not a small business, obviously, paying almost $800 million next year in compliance costs.
Wow.
That's just to comply with the law, 800 large. So that's not, massive deregulation for the first time ever is not a left-wing or a right-wing thing. It's not a moderate or a dry. It's what the Liberal Party has always believed in. It will energise the base, that we've actually got something to argue for, and it will certainly be a point of difference with the ALP, whose great love in life is increasing regulation, increasing the public sector to enforce it.
Yeah, I also think unifying around the modern version of what family means as well is part of that. Sorry, John, you get the last say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look, to add to what Michael said, we're on a bit of a unity ticket tonight. I agree with everything he said. But what I would say is this. I think the great division now in politics, whilst I admit it's very important to tell a story, we're not good at that. People like stories. That's the point of connection. I have to say, let's go beyond that. One of our problems is that we do too much feeling and not enough thinking.
Yes.
And we have got to get back to thinking. And I think a lot of, the future, presumably for the coalition under a Dutton-led team, will be to focus very heavily on explaining why sound economic management matters and set out a clear vision for tackling our horrendous debt, for improving the prospects for our children of not living under ever more onerous tax burdens with fewer and fewer options in life, including home ownership. There's plenty there if we want to think carefully and stand against emotionalism. As Ayaan Hirsi Ali puts it, we're in danger of becoming emocracies, where we are simply emote all the time rather than thinkocracies or democracies.
Absolutely. What a fascinating conversation, lads. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, as painful as it is to be having it. Thank you very much. Do appreciate it. John Anderson, Michael Kroger. The great Jim Molan joins us next. Fingers crossed he's going around for 6 years again in the Senate. Let's talk about the future of defence under what we understand will be Richard Marles. Yep, that Richard Marles. The bloke sends his homework to China as the Defence Minister. More in a sec. Senator Jim Molan is on the ballot paper at the election. He, of course, at this stage, looks like he could be getting the final spot in the New South Wales Senate, but we'll have to wait, watch and see. Jim, nice to talk to you, mate.
Paul, good to be here. So far, I think that life in opposition is not as bad as everyone's been telling me, Paul.
Oh, and everyone got a pay rise and it stopped raining and
absolutely
everything was fine again. So, look, let's not going to pretend. I'm not going to step back on anything I said for 6 weeks. I think that there's going to be some very big problems on national defence. I think the endless focus on climate, not China, is going to have consequences. We're going to have a defence minister now who, in my view, has been compromised by trying to find a way to negotiate and appease China. So let's talk about what defence looks like under the Labor government.
Well, the first thing I say to Labor is I hope you govern in your own right, because there are sensible people in Labor. There are no sensible people in the Greens. And as far as I can see, many of the independents are exactly the same. We've got to get away from the capillary and really go for the jugular. And this is what Michael Kroger and John Anderson were talking about when they were talking about a clear vision. We are a strategy. We have been a strategy-free government. You know, we spend and we promise, but how can you have a plan for spending a significant amount of money on defence which ignores fuel, manufacturing, civics in schools, energy, when you don't say when you need to produce something, so you produce plan after plan after plan, which goes out 20 years. You don't say what kind of a war you're preparing for, Paul, and it just becomes so silly. Now, I'm not knocking either Scott Morrison or Peter Dutton. I think that combination have produced more for defence than anyone else in the last 50 years. Now, we face a far greater threat now. Therefore, that is very, very important. They face a different threat, and that threat will only grow in the next 3 to 5 years during the period of the current government, of the Labor government. Now, we need to think strategically, and I've been yelling and screaming about this internally because I've been trying to do this internally, failed dramatically on doing that. You've got to align your strategy and your operations, and I think, Paul, we saw that very, very recently in the campaign, because if I go to the electorate of Chisholm, which was Gladys Liu's electorate, the woman who won it, Karina Garland, made 60,000 door knocks, 72,000 phone calls, 25,000 conversations, and she won. I've been mixed up with 6 electorates for the last year or so, particularly for the last 6 weeks. We did nothing like that. You've got to have your strategy correct, and you've got to take it down into your tactics. If we don't understand that in relation to running a campaign, how are we ever going to understand it for the national security of this country?
Just on the campaign side of things, obviously when you aren't the MP, don't have the responsibility of the MP, you can spend 2 years doing all of that stuff. Literally, this is the full-time job, is to go and knock on all those doors. But again, in the parts of Australia that you saw, how do you get somebody to join a political party? In this case, for you, the Liberal Party or the National Party. National Party did well. Again, all shades of green did pretty well, right? Nationals green, super lefty green, and teal blue green as well. But how do you get somebody to transfer from being a fan of what you say on Sky News, a fan of your Facebook page, to actually become paid up and proud and be willing to door knock for the candidate that you believe in, Jim?
Well, first you've got to have something to sell, Paul, and this is what you and your guests have been talking about tonight. We've got to define ourselves in a way that people want to buy what we've got to sell. Then secondly, you've got to start talking to people, and you've got to be willing to accept people into branches. Now, the people come and try to join our branches, and it takes them months to join our branches because we're all scared of factional politics. For crying out loud. So we end up with people who have been in the branches for with a number of exceptions. I've got to say, a number of fabulous electorates who do very well for their member. But that's not how we're going to win government back in 3 years' time. We've got to change the attitude. We've got to use social media. You know, getting our older membership to use social media is like pulling teeth. So all of those things have got to be done. We've got fantastic people that work unbelievably hard, but it was ineffective working because we didn't put in the years of work beforehand to do exactly this. And, you know, and as I say, Paul, it's a reflection. If we can't align strategy and the big things, big areas of operations and tactics, if we can't align them in our own strategy, in our own campaigns, how are we going to do it for national security, which is 1 million times more complex?
So we know what the new government faces. We know that China is what it faces. Richard Marles, I think, is a person who has tried to find a way to, you know, be the, I don't know, this generation's chief negotiator or something. He's thinking that if he goes and runs between the Chinese embassy and his own party, somehow, you know, we'll fix it all. They're going to play him off a break here.
I'm worried that may occur in the first period of time, but I have some faith. Once you put aside campaigning and the convoluted arguments that we all have, fundamentally the Labor Party, and I don't say the Greens or the Independents do, fundamentally the Labor Party want Australia to continue generally the way it is. They'll tend towards the left and towards socialism. Richard Marles will be the same. I suspect that he has been made so paranoid about the allegations that have been made against him in relation to China, and I can assure you that we will be watching him very, very closely. And if he wants advice, we'll be advising him, because we have been through this time and time again. And if I've got any message for him, it is, for God's sake, get the bloody strategy organised before you get into the tactics, because buying aeroplanes and tanks and things is great fun. Politicians love doing it, but get the strategy right, because if you don't get the strategy right, as I said in my six-part podcast, Paul, if you don't get the strategy right, it is noise before defeat. And I believe that we run a real potential risk in the Western Pacific of war in this region, much more likely than most people say, in the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, also, it's going to be fascinating to see that Quad meeting that Albo is going to be at in the next couple of days. He's obviously a passenger in it. He'll have a position in it. He'll obviously ceremonial, all the rest of it. But I certainly hope he sits back and takes some notes rather than says, you know what, I reckon, boys, we should this, we should that. Hang on, who are you? What are you doing here? Anyway, we'll wait, watch and see. Thank you, Senator. All the best for your re-election. We'll find out more in the next couple of days.
Thanks, Paul. 41% yet, and we'll see how it goes. Thank you.
You'll be right. Thank you, mate. All right, quick break. A lady who is on her way to Canberra, looking forward to celebrating this one. Jacinta Price is next as the next senator from the Northern Territory. Plenty more here to talk about on Paul Murray Live special 2-hour edition on I Get It. It's a tough night, but this is the resistance. We're not breaking. We're not sooking. Here on Paul Murray Live. Thank you so much for watching. We have been looking forward to this moment for a long time. We thought the feeling around it might be a little bit better, but I still take great delight that Jacinta Price is on her way towards the federal parliament as the next senator from the Northern Territory. Senator-elect, nice to talk to you, darling. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling really good. I always feel quite strong from a position, I guess an underdog position, where I know there's a lot of work to be done, and there's certainly a whole lot of people to hold to account going forward. But I'm feeling really strong. I'm feeling like I've got an incredible amount of support behind me, and I'm ready to get out there and fight on behalf of Australians. I think I think Australia will soon realise that they've just elected our Joe Biden to run the country. And they're just going to have to learn the hard way. But I'm certainly going to be there to hold them to account and to help pick up the pieces once we have to, when we get there.
Well, also, we obviously heard a lot about Albo's upbringing, and I've got to say I agree with what Richo wrote about how that it is an inspiring story, that somebody can go from Housing Commission eventually up to the Prime Ministership, right? What does it say to Indigenous girls in the Territory that if you are a Conservative, you too have a path? You don't have to tread the identitarian path that goes via the Labor Party and all of that, that free-thinking young Indigenous women have got a future in the Parliament.
Absolutely, they do. And you know what? I think they're starting to certainly realise that, especially in the bush now, particularly after this campaign, is that we're seeing a swing toward us in the bush, about 4.2% closing the margin in Lingiari. As we know, those results aren't confirmed yet. So that is still in play for us. And having been on the ground and had conversations with a lot of Indigenous people in remote communities, particularly young women, they're realising that, you do have a voice. You can use your voice. You can get there, and anything is possible. And that's what's remarkable. I think, look at my mum's own story, how she was born in the bush, grew up in a humpy, which is like a traditional sort of makeshift shelter. English was the third language to her, and she became a minister of the Crown, and now, of course, myself being her daughter, I'm now going to be, well, I am a senator of the Northern Territory. So, yes, anything is absolutely possible, and that's what I certainly take away from this whole experience, and I want to continue to push. And of course, the incredible Warren Mundine and his wife came up to help over the last few days, and Warren and I, along with a number of other Indigenous conservatives, are now going to make sure that we're encouraging other Indigenous conservatives to be proud of who they are, and to stand firm and strong and know that there are a whole lot of us out there and we're all prepared to stand by them, and that you don't have to belong to Labor just because you're Indigenous. It's a racial stereotype that we can smash.
Fantastic. The Prime Minister made it very clear a couple of times in his speech last night about the Uluru Statement, about not just a voice to Parliament, but making sure that it goes into the Constitution. Now, I understand the symbolism of all of it, but if it doesn't have a budget and it doesn't have control of anything, it is symbolism. He and his supporters will claim that this is a transformative bit of symbolism that we need. Have you been convinced by that argument?
Not one bit. Again, where do they say they're going to reduce the rates of domestic and family violence in remote communities? Where are they? Where is it they say they're going to reduce the rates of child sexual abuse in Indigenous communities? Where they're going to provide jobs in these little socialist communities that are out of sight and out of mind, and provide economic development opportunities? Where does any of this say it's going to accomplish these sorts of things and bring Indigenous people in remote communities into the modern world like the rest of Australia, like those who are sitting proudly in their seats now? Where are they going to create the same opportunities that their children are having for those people who are out of sight and out of mind? That's what I want to know. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in fixing those really critical problems, not being the champion of some other symbolic gesture, and so they can go down in history to say that they provided the opportunity for a voice to Parliament and those sorts of things. I've said it over again. It could be very likely that we might have 3 Indigenous women from the Northern Territory in federal Parliament. No doubt there will be other Indigenous people elected into Parliament that don't have to be a voice to Parliament because they're actually in Parliament. And they should be doing their jobs, not just for marginalised Indigenous Australians, but for all Australians as well, to prosper and to have a great life in a very lucky country, because that's what it's all about. So, yeah, I'm not interested in these symbolic gestures anymore. I'm really not interested. I'm interested in practical ways forward.
I can't wait for the next 6 years of what you're going to do. Enjoy every moment of it. We're going to cheer you on all day, every day. You're going to be our favourite person in Canberra, without question. And I know that's going to annoy a lot of other people, but we are so proud of you. We're so happy for you, and we're so thankful for you, Jacinta. Congratulations, darling.
Thank you, and thank you to all the wonderful Australians out there who have had my back throughout all of this. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to getting stuck into Parliament for you and fighting on behalf of all of us and putting a few people in their place.
Oh, Senator, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Good on you, darling.
Thanks, Paul.
Jacinta Price, how good is she? Quick break, back with plenty more to talk about, including, look, there is one thing that was absolutely clear. The campaign meant nothing. What does it mean, as well as how the Liberal Party picks its candidates? I'll talk about it with Sophie Ellsworth, media writer at The Australian, Tina McQueen, Vice President of the Liberal Party. Next. Thank you so much for watching. Plenty to talk about with Tina McQueen, of course, Vice President of the Federal Liberal Party. Thank you for turning up tonight. And none other than Sophie Ellsworth, who is beautiful in blue as always, and one of the sane people in Melbourne who didn't go all teal, which I appreciate. She's, of course, media writer for the Australian newspaper. Sophie, look, the hot takes coming from the lefty journalists, and I'm sure there'll be a lot about that in the paper tomorrow. Oh, the media's a disgrace for their campaign, all the rest of it. I'll tell you why the campaign looks like the way the campaign looked like, and then you tell me if I'm 100% wrong. We have spent 3 years 3 years where one line from one interview was replayed over and over and over and over and over again. We live in a world full of images that feed into the metaphor and the metaphor of the good guy and the bad guy, all the rest of it, right? You have a media that, probably got a bit up itself how often it was talking about itself and filming itself and all the rest of it as the participant in politics. But that's no different than the people who roam around the press gallery all day, every day. They view themselves as participants in the process, not observers of the process. So, Soph, how off the mark am I?
Well, Paul, I think what was really interesting with the Canberra press pack towards the later end of this election campaign is that they really went hard on Anthony Albanese, and he had a pretty soft run over the last 3 years. We obviously went through that pandemic period where we had the Prime Minister up most days addressing the country, and Albo was in the background and able to do very little. But then when the media really started to ask him tough questions, it really started to shine through that Albanese wasn't up to the job. But it will be interesting to see from here on in, because we know so much of the media in Australia, Paul, is of left-leaning persuasion, whether they really hold Anthony Albanese to account. But I will say this, Paul, the biggest disappointment, I think, in the media landscape is the Coalition were in power for 9 years. They did absolutely nothing about the ABC. The ABC bashed them relentlessly. They went after Conservative Coalition MPs. And now they're left with the awful situation where they can't do anything about it. And it serves them right, Paul. They were weak and they're going to have to suck it up now. But I bet you we will not see Louise Milligan and Four Corners go after Labor male MPs like that program did of Conservative male politicians.
Yep, plus a whole bunch of other ones with awards on the shelf right now. Don't forget, will there be a two-part bubble investigation into the 44 female staffers of the Labor Party who came out, remember, at the height of all of this, talking about the behaviour inside the Labor Party? No. Because they achieved what they wanted, which was the problem with women issue. Tina, headline first, and I'll start asking you more specific questions. How are you holding up?
Oh, it's upsetting, Paul. It's devastating. I think Scott Morrison's a very good Prime Minister. But then you get up with a spring in your step and you fight back. And that's what we have to do. The problems are obvious, some of them, some not so, but we've got to whack back.
So just inside the machine of the Liberal Party, right? And again, when you win, all of this stuff's kind of papered over. When you lose, all of this stuff's in the spotlight, right? Now, generally I sort of think of it a little bit like, sort of nippers running and trying to grab that thing in the sand, right? Which is that there's this fight for control and the council and the this and the picking. But we can all agree that a process that produces candidates days before an election is a disgrace.
It's never going to work.
From the left, from the right, from anyone who did their bit to delay that process.
And I think of 9 captains' picks, we lost 8, and the one that held Hughes, I think, was 10 or 12% gone backwards. That cannot happen again. And I think this is the problem with the base. Paul, they had the shits. They didn't pick candidates. And with all due respect to Senator Moll, when we did have a pre-selection, Jim didn't turn up. He zoomed in and still got pre-selected, so they doubled down on the shits. The other thing is, from spending days and weeks at pre-polls and everything, and I hate to say this, Scott Morrison was an excellent Prime Minister, but neither leader inspired or excited the public. They were so over it, and I could tell they were going to that pre-poll and voted with just saying, I don't give a poop. Green, teal, don't care, get it over with. That's the attitude I felt throughout consistently.
So you saw on the Central Coast that Singo was able to turn around, put out ads and basically said, whatever you did last time, do the opposite, right? It worked on the Liberal side of things. It didn't work on the Labor side of things. But it feels, again, when you're, the federal vice president, you're trying to look at a country with 51 separate fights. But there are very specific, it's almost like rather than these sort of one issues that sweep the nation, that kind of it's the entire continent of Europe where, central Queensland versus how to play it in Melbourne versus all the rest of it here. Again, I envy Labor's capacity to have enforced discipline that means Penny Wong told us she was anti-same-sex marriage for 3 years. How does the Liberal Party deal with those fundamental things that if you've lost the fight, you've got to suck it up and argue the policy anyway?
Well, as I said a couple of weeks ago and landed on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald and I got into a great deal of trouble for, let those seats go. Let them go. Those inner city seats, we're not going to get them back. The boundaries can't go any further to the water. Our people are the people in the suburbs, the people troubled with their electricity bill, as we discussed before, mortgages, schools, education, all of that. As Barnaby, didn't lose a seat, the Nationals didn't lose a seat. We've got to concentrate on people that relate to us, aspirational people that we can help, not these dipsticks that don't care, that have the money, that don't have the luxury not to care.
Yeah, I mean, Sophie, again, I mentioned a bit earlier in the show that there's a bit of analysis in the Financial Review that suggests the Liberal Party went forward in places with very high welfare dependency. Now, these were, of course, outer suburbs issues, and whether that's liking the Liberal Party or hating Dan Andrews, who knows? All we know is they number, and then everyone gets to work out what that actually means, apart from one team wins, one team doesn't. But again, I'm not pretending that losing 5 seats if you're a government is a gift. But in my view, the gift to the Labor Party or the Liberal Party is to jettison these inner city areas, let them have their own, People's Republic of Radio National, and go and win the suburbs and the regions, and you can form 76 seats.
Yep.
Exactly, Paul. And looking in around just the seats in Melbourne, which I live close to, Goldstein, a lot of those people in that seat could work during the pandemic. A lot of, people in high wealth areas, that weren't impacted by the pandemic. Now go out to the outer suburbs, and that wasn't the case, Paul. And I think the Liberal Party has really let themselves down because they've focused on these seats so much and forgotten about what they really stand for. And to be honest, Paul, I'm glad to see a lot of those MPs go.
Ditto.
I don't think they stand for really conservative values. And I think I've got friends who are Liberal voters, Paul, that said to me, educated women in professional roles saying to me weeks ago, I don't actually know what the Liberal Party stands for. I don't know what any of their policies are. None of them were talking about climate change. They're worried about their kids' education. They're worried about the cost of living. Those real issues, the fact that we were living under ridiculous lockdowns. But instead, we've got this whole concern in the Liberal Party about this woke agenda, bowing to these climate activists, and it's cost them big, and I have no sympathy for them, Paul, I'm sorry to say.
Well, also, interesting just about a couple of sort of these lefties, right, which is, some of these people argued for what eventually became the change in the land that same-sex marriage can happen.
Yep.
That was a fantastic thing for the country, in my view, right? Their punishment, they weren't protected by the ABC for services to the ABC. They became the targets of the phenomenon that was these independents. Now, at some point, this was going to happen. I'm disappointed it happened on the former government's watch, but there's opportunity that comes as a result of it. So my thing is that, the media is going to turn around and say, or parts of the media turn around and say, you were too mean on the Teals, the fake independents, the attacks on the cult only grew it. No, there is a seismic shift that's happening. And Labor, I'm telling you now, they win government, could be 3, 6, 9, 24 years. I don't know. But the Greens are the wolf in the hen house because while they deliver you the preferences, now they take your seats in the long run.
And Paul, I think by our government trying to please everyone and neutralise every argument, stupid. You can't do that. You need the fight. You need the argument. In trying to please everyone, you're not pleasing anyone. But as for writing off the Liberal Party, as some people are doing, don't do it, because these Teals are going to be an absolute disaster. They've gone in with, 2 or 3 batshit crazy policies. Let's see how that goes. But again, I'm not too concerned about these seats. Look after the people that need our care and those that kept our vote and appreciated what the Prime Minister did for them during those difficult times.
But also, Sophie, these. So again, right? It's going to be chicken and egg. So obviously the argument at the end of the day is, these electorates, they were so ripe for these people that therefore it was right for the ABC, the Guardian and the Channel 9 papers to pump them all day, every day, because we were just matching the mood. Now, this was a hack, and it was a brilliant hack, and it worked an absolute treat. But once these candidates went from being, and there's an independent that runs in every one of these seats 3 years ago, 6 years ago, 9 years ago, 30 years ago, but none of them came with the gold stamp of the Pirate or the ABC. These ones came with the gold stamp of a particular part of society, and that supercharged them up the ladder to a quarter of the vote. Preferences from Labor and Greens gets them to 50 and whatever.
That's right, Paul. I mean, they had a huge endorsement with massive donations. But look, what I found really interesting, Paul, was Di Lee. Now look at her as an independent. Now she got such little coverage on our public broadcaster. In fact, very little at all. Now that she's won that seat of Fowler, suddenly the media are interested in her. And that just says it all. These Teals got so much oxygen, so much press. To be honest, Paul, I think they're a bunch of hypocrites. I'll give you just a little example. In Goldstein, they've had trucks circling around for weeks and weeks. Monique Ryan has had them in her electorate as well, with those signs on these little trucks burning around the suburbs. They're not electric vehicles. Now imagine all the emissions they've been pumping out into the air. These people don't practice what they preach, and that's what I don't like about them. They stand there and say we're all about gender equality. When Jane Hume was getting attacked verbally in the street by Simon Holmes à Court, I didn't see anyone step up for her. The females there, Monique Ryan, anyone there say, this isn't okay. You can't speak to a woman like this. Can you imagine if that was the other side of politics? I find them so hypocritical, and I think people will see through them pretty quickly, Paul.
Exactly.
But also, elephant in the room, I mean, as I mentioned a bit earlier, based off the obvious here, a lot of women didn't just go left, they went hard left at this election. The reality is that, you know, the daughters of the Howard haters are now middle-aged ladies who are absolutely in a position to be able to take control, as well as their right to do so. But I think that a lot of people who think that this is some sort of singular phenomenon, it's been coming for a long time, and it is a tipping point in terms of what the party represents, how it presents itself, how it markets itself. So I want to ask you about how to reconnect with women. Clearly, I'm a bloke and have no idea, but what do you think that it means, Tina?
Well, we had a number of female candidates, but again, they didn't have long enough on the ground, Paul. They just didn't, so it's a problem that clearly we're going to have to deal with. But if a woman has a chance of picking an easy route with a seat where they're given a couple of $1 million and just stand there and speak, as to working hard on the ground, knocking on doors and letterbox dropping and doing all that, which one are they going to pick?
Yeah, correct.
They're going to take the easy route. So we've got to work out how to combat that.
But also, again, Sophie, it's a bigger, complicated thing, and I have no doubt that it'll be the endless discussion on Mamma Mia and all the rest of it for the next three years. Good luck, right? But I love that, it's not about the vote of all women. It's a vote of women going left. Lefty women have now found a home with the Greens and a home in the fake independents. It's been building for a long period of time, and as you talked about here, this particular cohort used the language of inclusivity, but couldn't be bigger bullies, as we saw with the Mean Girls, couldn't be more aggressive than as we see with what happens to Jacinta Price if you dare sort of speak against the collective. This new form of very active, very powerful, very cashed up left-leaning woman is going to be just as aggressive about their patch of power than any white, pale and stale bloke ever was.
They will, Paul, but what annoys me is there's this perception that all women think the same, and we don't. There's a lot of people that don't endorse those fake independents. There's a lot of people that don't think like them. I, for one, I'm not one standing here saying we need quotas in Parliament. It should be about the best person. But, for example, in my electorate, I'm in the seat of Macnamara. I had no idea who my local Liberal candidate was. I think she was parachuted in at the end. Colleen Harkin. I'd never heard of her until a few weeks ago. Now, I know it's not a Liberal seat, never been a Liberal seat, but I was scratching to find information about it. Catherine Deves, I mean, she was silenced throughout this campaign. A lot of Conservative women resonated with her, but she wasn't allowed to talk to the media. So the Liberal Party were just an absolute mess throughout this campaign, Paul. And there were, you know, when you're looking to find women to look within the Liberal Party, someone like Catherine Deves should have been given airtime, but she was shut down. And that only hurt them. So I think they really need to think about what they stand for. And remember, not all women think the same, Paul.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not pretending otherwise. It's just literally for the economy of language in the hosting of a TV show, I say the things that I do, not about assumptions about which way all people go. No way.
Paul,
never.
I've been watching women in Parliament for a long time, more women, less women, and these new teal breed, I can promise you, within 6 months, it's going to be an absolute bloody nightmare.
All right, I'm with you. Thank you very much, ladies. Do appreciate it. Remember, we do not give in, we do not sook, we do not carry on. Resistance every night, 8 o'clock. Ta-da.